The room buzzed with the kind of noise only a family gathering could generate, a blend of laughter, casual chatter, the clinking of glasses, and the soft hum of conversations overlapping in a way that seemed as natural as breathing. But despite the festive atmosphere, I felt the weight of the eyes on me. The large wooden table at the center of the room was stacked high with food, the familiar smells of my childhood filling the space. My mom and dad were seated at the head, just like they always were, a sense of authority emanating from them, even in their old age. But I couldn't focus on the food or the laughter. My mind was elsewhere, on the questions I'd been avoiding for years. I watched as my cousin, Claire, passed the mashed potatoes around the table, her eyes glancing at me briefly before moving to the next person. Her smile was polite, almost too polite, like the kind of smile people give when they're not sure what to say but don't want to seem rude. "I heard you're still working on that project," my aunt called across the table, her voice too loud for my comfort. It was a direct jab, wrapped in the innocent question of family concern. "Yeah," I muttered, pushing the food around on my plate. I could feel the heat of their eyes, my father's sharp gaze, my mother's worried glance. All trained on me, waiting for an answer. "Is it really what you want to be doing?" My uncle, who had never understood the path I'd chosen, asked from the other end of the table. A shift in the atmosphere was palpable. The air seemed to tighten as everyone else waited for my response. I could almost hear their thoughts, their judgments. "You should be more like your cousin. She's got it all figured out. A stable job, a nice house. Why can't you just settle down?" There it was, the unspoken expectation that had hovered over me for years, the feeling that no matter how hard I tried, I could never be enough for them. My career had always been the subject of their disapproval. Choosing a non-traditional path in the military, choosing to be the first woman to take on a leadership role in a male-dominated space, had never sat well with them. They called it a phase, something I'd grow out of. But the more I persevered, the more it seemed to alienate me from the people I loved most. Was I making a mistake? Would I ever be good enough? Was I chasing a dream that was too far from their expectations? My father, sitting at the head of the table, didn't speak right away. He just observed me, his eyes betraying years of disappointment and quiet frustration. I wanted to tell him it wasn't a phase. I wanted to scream that I wasn't looking for approval, not anymore. But his silence, and the silence of everyone else, felt like a weight too heavy to lift. The doubt crept in slowly, like an insidious voice whispering in the back of my mind. What if they were right? What if I was never going to fulfill their dreams of me, or my own for that matter? I could feel the walls of the room closing in on me, the space shrinking as the laughter around me started to fade into white noise. The pressure mounted, a constant thrum in my chest. The question I'd asked myself 1,000 times rose again. Am I enough? And then, in the middle of it all, my sister's fiancé, Daniel, sat back in his chair, his eyes not on me but on everyone else. He had always been the quiet one, the observer in the family, but his presence was enough to make people pause. He had been with us for years, long enough to understand the dynamics of our family, long enough to see the struggles I faced but never once made a judgment. I never expected much from him. He was just the guy who loved my sister. But that day, in the thick of my self-doubt, his words hit me like a wave. "Wait," he said, his voice cutting through the chatter. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, but everyone fell silent, looking to him. His eyes shifted to mine, locking with a quiet certainty that caught me off guard. "Lieutenant General?" he asked, his voice calm but full of recognition. The words hung in the air, a simple statement, yet one that pierced the quiet tension. There was no judgment. In his tone, no skepticism or condescension, just understanding. And in that moment, for the first time, I wasn't the woman being scrutinized. I wasn't the failure or the disappointment. I was seen for what I truly was. I had earned this. For a second, I let the weight of that realization sink in. I wasn't invisible. And maybe, just maybe, that was all I ever needed to hear. As the family gathered their thoughts and mumbled under their breath, I sat back in my chair, my chest a little lighter, my heart a little steadier. For once, I didn't feel like I had to justify my choices or explain my journey. Daniel's words were a quiet affirmation that things were finally shifting. In that one moment, it wasn't just about family expectations. It was about me, my path, my choices. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't questioning myself. I was ready to stand tall. The wind bit at my face as I stood outside the military base, the concrete beneath my boots cold and unforgiving. I had just completed my latest training session, and my muscles ached, but I didn't mind. A quiet satisfaction lingered in the exhaustion. It wasn't just the physical challenge of the job, it was the knowledge that I was doing something no one expected. I had always been the different one in my family, the one whose dreams seemed too big, too far removed from the world they understood. My father wanted me to be an engineer, like him, stable, respected, predictable. My mother had imagined me taking the traditional route, finding a suitable job and marrying into a life of comfort. They never understood why I chose a path that was rougher, less certain. And I hadn't made it any easier by pursuing something as unconventional as a military career, where women weren't exactly welcomed with open arms. At the time, I didn't know why I felt so drawn to this life. Maybe it was the sense of discipline, the camaraderie, the idea of serving something greater than myself. Or maybe it was just the challenge, the desire to prove that I could do it, just like everyone else, despite the odds. But I had a difficult time convincing them. I remember sitting at the dinner table, my father's hard gaze drilling into me as I told them what I wanted to do. Military? He had scoffed, disbelief and disappointment flooding his face. Why would you throw your life away like that? My mother had been quieter, her eyes brimming with a mix of concern and confusion. She'd always been supportive, but I could see that she didn't understand either. The words they said weren't the ones that stung. It was the silence that followed. Them. The way they both had looked at me like I had made an irreparable mistake, choosing a path that felt uncertain even to me. There were nights I lay awake, wondering if they were right. If I was just chasing something foolish, something I couldn't possibly achieve. But then I thought about the stories I'd heard growing up. Stories of heroes who didn't fit the mold. People who made the impossible seem possible. And I knew that if I didn't at least try, I would regret it for the rest of my life. I applied anyway, and when the letter came in inviting me to enlist, I didn't hesitate. I packed my things and left without another word. The first few months were the hardest. The physical strain, the mental toll of adjusting to the rigid discipline, the unspoken tension with the men around me. My presence felt like an anomaly, a test of whether I could handle it or not. The constant whispering behind my back, the sideways glances, the doubts, they were all there. But I kept my head down and kept pushing. I couldn't afford to be anything less than perfect. They needed to see that I belonged. I needed them to see it. But it wasn't just the military world that was a challenge. It was the outside world, too. My family didn't understand what I was doing. The letters and phone calls came less frequently, and when they did, it was with a kind of weary skepticism that felt like they were just waiting for me to come to my senses. "Come home, sweetheart," my mother would say over the phone, her voice soft with concern. "You don't have to do this. There are other ways to make a difference." Every time she said it, I felt a little more disconnected from them. They didn't see what I saw. They didn't feel the fire in my gut that told me this was the only way. I didn't want to let them down, but I also didn't want to let myself down either. I missed birthdays, family gatherings, and holidays. There was always something else to focus on, another mission, another training exercise. I remember a particular Christmas, when I couldn't get a flight home. I spent the evening in a sterile, gray cafeteria, alone except for a few other soldiers who, like me, had nowhere else to be. The absence of home, the lack of warmth, was overwhelming. I thought back to that dinner table, those faces, those voices telling me I wasn't cut out for this. And for a fleeting moment I wondered if they were right. But then I remembered the moment I first put on the uniform. The first time I felt like I was part of something that mattered. The first time I saw the potential to not just fit in, but to make an impact. And that feeling, that surge of purpose, was worth every sacrifice. I pushed forward, proving myself with every obstacle I overcame. It wasn't always easy. I faced doubts, both from others and from myself. But the deeper I got into my career, the more I realized that this path, this difficult, lonely, and uncertain road, was the one that would ultimately lead me to where I needed to be. The day I made Lieutenant General felt like a culmination of everything I had fought for. Every battle, every lonely night, every judgment cast by others had been leading me to that moment. But that wasn't the end of the journey. Far from it. As I stood there in my uniform, feeling the weight of the title settle over me, I realized something that had been so elusive for so long. It wasn't about them. It was about me. And for the first time, I felt like I had made the right choice, not for anyone else, but for myself. Looking back, I knew I had chosen the path less taken. The road less traveled by was, in the end, the one that had made all the difference. And while I still had much left to prove, I knew this wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for every woman who had ever been told she couldn't do it. Every person who had ever been made to feel small, to feel like they didn't belong. I was no longer just a woman who defied the odds. I was proof that the odds could be beaten. The laughter in the room was hollow now, and almost forced, noise that echoed in the back of my mind. The conversations, once light-hearted, had taken on a heavier tone. My family's eyes were fixed on me, their attention sharpening with every word. I should have known it would come up eventually. My career. After all, it always did. The tightness in my chest was a familiar feeling by now, but it never quite got easier to deal with. "We're just concerned," my father's voice cut through the air like a blade. His words, though carefully chosen, had an underlying sharpness to them. "You've been at this for how long now? How many more years until you're in a position where this actually means something?" I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat, threatening to choke me. This wasn't the first time he'd said something like this, but today it stung a little more. I could feel everyone's eyes, my mother's, my brother's, my cousin's, all of them watching, waiting for me to respond. The pressure was mounting, thick like the humidity before a storm. "I'm doing something important," I managed to say, though my voice trembled slightly. "What I'm doing matters." My mother, who had always been quiet in her disapproval, chimed in softly, her voice laced with concern. "But is it worth it? The time you've missed with us, the holidays alone? We want you here, not out there fighting battles we don't understand." I wanted to tell her how much I missed them too, how much I longed to be a part of everything they seemed to effortlessly enjoy. But the truth was, I felt like an outsider in my own family. I had chosen a life that required sacrifice, that demanded commitment, and yet every time I returned, there was a familiar question in the air. Was it really worth it? "You've failed to see how much you've missed." My uncle's voice was firm, blunt. "What good is all this if you can't even make time for your family?" The words echoed in my mind long after they were spoken. Failed. I could almost feel the weight of that word pressing down on me, suffocating any self-confidence I had left. "Maybe we've been too hard on her," my cousin Claire said, her voice hesitant, as if she didn't want to be the one to make the moment worse. But she did anyway. But don't you think it's time to come home, for good? Get a real job, settle down, be part of the family? Again? The words hit like a slap. Get a real job! In her mind, what I was doing wasn't real, and in that moment I wondered, just for a split second, if maybe she was right. What was I doing? I looked around at their faces, their expectant, disappointed eyes, and I felt my resolve crack. Maybe I had made a mistake. Maybe this military career wasn't what I was meant to do. Maybe I had been wrong to think I could fight for something bigger than myself. My chest tightened, and I could feel the walls closing in. The silence that followed my cousin's words was suffocating. I wanted to say something, anything, that would make this feeling go away. I wanted to shout that I wasn't the failure they seemed to think I was, but instead all that came out was a weak, "I'm trying." Trying to what? Prove them wrong? Or prove that I could still belong? In that moment, I felt completely alone. The family I had fought so hard to make proud seemed like strangers, their judgments hanging over me like an invisible weight. The doubt that had been quietly simmering beneath the surface of my mind for so long began to boil over, threatening to drown me. I wanted to leave, to escape the suffocating reality of their expectations. But more than that, I wanted their approval. I wanted them to see me as more than the daughter who'd chosen a path that defied everything they believed in. As I sat there, the room spinning with their words, I thought back to the reason I had chosen this path, the reason I had stepped away from the comfort of family and a predictable life. I had wanted something bigger, something I could pour myself into, a career where I wasn't just filling a role, but creating a space for others like me. Women who had never been given the chance to rise, who had always been told their place was somewhere beneath the surface. I hadn't just chosen the military because I liked the uniform. I had chosen it because I wanted to lead, to break down barriers, to prove to myself and the world that I was capable of more. But now, sitting there, I questioned if it was worth it. Had I failed? The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable, and in that silence, the truth became clear. Hadn't failed. I had chosen a difficult path, one that required sacrifices, sacrifices that no one understood but me. And even if they didn't get it, even if they never would, I had to remind myself why I was here. I wasn't just doing this for them. I was doing it for me, for the woman I was becoming, for the lives I hoped to change, for the legacy I wanted to leave behind. The doubt that had crept in, the nagging feeling of failure, was just a fleeting moment. It wasn't my truth. And as the conversation continued around me, my mind cleared. I was not a failure. I was in the middle of a battle, but it was one I was determined to win, not for their approval, but for my own. I had made my choice, and no one could take that away from me. The tension in the room had reached its peak, the conversations dying down as my father's voice echoed in my head, his disappointment still hanging heavily in the air. Every glance, every word from my family felt like an unspoken reproach. I had spent years trying to prove myself in a world that didn't see me, in a space that had never believed I belonged. And now, here I was, sitting at this table, fighting to hold on to a sense of worth, not just for myself, but for them. But the more they spoke, the more I doubted my choices. My mother's eyes, tired and filled with concern, locked onto mine as if she was silently pleading for me to turn away from this path. Her voice trembled as she spoke again. "We're just worried, honey. This path, it's so uncertain. You've sacrificed so much for it, but at what cost?" I felt a burning need to defend myself, to tell them everything I'd been through, the challenges I'd faced to get where I was. But the words wouldn't come. It was as though every sentence I had prepared to speak vanished into the weight of their judgments. I opened my mouth to reply, but before I could, I felt a gentle, pressure on my arm. It was subtle, but enough to pull me from the thick fog of doubt clouding my thoughts. I turned to see Daniel standing next to me, his calm eyes meeting mine, as if he knew exactly what I needed to hear in that moment. The silence was broken by his soft voice, and I could feel the room fall into a hushed stillness as he spoke, as though everyone was waiting for his words. "Wait," he said, a slight frown furrowing his brow. The words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the tension that had built up until now. "Lieutenant General?" The room went still, and I could feel all eyes turning toward him. My father's brow furrowed as he looked at Daniel, clearly confused. My mother's expression shifted from concern to curiosity. Everyone at the table had stopped, their gazes, shifting between Daniel and me, as if they were waiting for some explanation, some clarification. But it wasn't Daniel's words that mattered. It was how he said them. There was no question in his tone. There was no hesitation. There was only a quiet confidence, a recognition of something I had earned, something I had worked for, something my family had failed to acknowledge until now. I turned to face him, my heart racing. My mind tried to process what had just happened. "What?" I started to ask, my voice barely a whisper, unsure whether I had heard him correctly. Daniel smiled faintly, his gaze unwavering. "I've watched you. I know what you've done. I don't think you even realize what you've accomplished, but I do. You're not just anyone, and you've earned every title, every step you've taken to get here." The words he spoke, simple, sincere, cut through the cloud of doubt I had been carrying for so long. They weren't just words of encouragement. They were words of recognition. Daniel had seen me, really seen me in a way that no one else had in a long time. And in that moment, I realized something profound. I didn't need my family's approval. I needed to recognize myself. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes flicking between Daniel and me. He seemed to be searching for some response, some rebuttal to this unexpected affirmation, but the truth was, he had nothing to say. His disappointment was no longer a weapon I had to defend against. It was simply a reflection of his own struggle to understand me, to understand why I'd chosen this path. Daniel's words hung in the air, resonating deeply within me. I had spent so much of my life looking for validation from others, my family, my colleagues, the world around me. I had sought their approval, hoping that one day they would see me as I saw myself. But in that brief moment, Daniel showed me something different. The recognition I craved wasn't something to be given by anyone else. It had to come from within me first. "You've done more than anyone could have expected," Daniel continued, his voice steady, unwavering. "And maybe they don't see it yet, but I do. And that's what matters." The words hit me harder than I expected, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't questioning myself. I wasn't worrying about what my family thought, or whether I had chosen the right path. I had chosen it. And that was enough. I sat back in my chair, the weight that had been pressing on my chest for so long slowly lifting. Daniel's recognition, his simple acknowledgement of everything I had accomplished, gave me the clarity I needed. It wasn't the validation of others that mattered. It was mine. And as I sat there, a quiet resolve began to build within me. The doubts that had plagued me for so long, the uncertainty about whether I was making the right choices began to fade. This was my journey, my path. I had made it this far, and there was no turning back now. My family watched as Daniel's words sank in, the realization dawning on them that this wasn't a passing phase. This wasn't something that could be brushed aside or dismissed as youthful ambition. I had earned my place, and I would continue to do so. As the room slowly came back to life, the conversations resuming, I felt a shift. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but something subtle, something profound. I had been seen, finally. And it wasn't just by Daniel, it was by me. The conversation with Daniel lingered long after that night. His words echoed in the back of my mind. A quiet reminder that I had already accomplished more than I gave myself credit for. Yet, as the days passed, something shifted within me. It wasn't just about proving them wrong anymore. It wasn't about seeking approval from anyone, not even my family. It was about proving something to myself. I had spent so much of my life looking for validation, hoping that one day my achievements would be recognized and appreciated. But now, I realized that the only validation I needed was my own. Daniel had opened my eyes to the fact that I was already where I needed to be. I had earned my place, not because of anyone else's opinion, but because of my own effort, my own resilience. With that newfound clarity, I woke up every day with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't going to let my family's doubts, or anyone else's, hold me back anymore. If anything, their skepticism had become fuel. It was time to rise above it, to push forward in ways I hadn't before. The next week, I made an appointment with my commanding officer, a man who had always respected my work, but had never fully acknowledged my potential. There had always been a quiet barrier between us, one that I hadn't fully understood at the time, but now it seemed clear. I had let myself hide behind my doubts, behind the need for approval. It was time to step out of that shadow. When I walked into his office, his gaze met mine, and I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, almost like he had been waiting for this moment. "General Walker," he said, his tone formal but warm. "What can I do for you?" I stood straighter, my posture more confident than it had ever been before. "I'm here to talk about a new assignment," I said, my voice steady, unwavering. "Something that will allow me to prove to myself that I belong in this role." His eyes narrowed slightly, as if he wasn't sure where this conversation was going. But I could see the curiosity in his expression, the same curiosity I had seen in Daniel's eyes. Only this time, it was aimed at me. "We need leaders in this department," I continued. "But not just anyone. We need someone who has fought for a place at the table, someone who understands what it means to rise from the bottom and still stay grounded. I'm ready for that challenge." There was a long silence as he studied me, his eyes lingering on mine for what felt like an eternity. And then, to my surprise, he nodded. "All right," he said finally. "I'll put you in charge of the next strategic operation. We'll give you full control of the project. It's yours to lead." I didn't know what to say at first. I had expected him to be hesitant, maybe even dismissive. But instead, he saw something in me that I hadn't even realized was there, something stronger than just determination. He saw leadership. As I left his office, the weight that had been resting on my shoulders for so long started to lift. I wasn't just the woman who had failed in their eyes. I was now the woman they had to take seriously. This was my chance to prove that I wasn't just here to take up space. I was here to make a difference. The following days were a whirlwind of meetings, preparations, and strategic planning. I threw myself into the project with a renewed vigor. It was no longer about fitting into someone else's expectations. This was about building something for myself, something I could be proud of. And as I worked, I felt the weight of self-doubt, slipping further away, replaced by an unshakable belief in my abilities. Each decision I made, each challenge I overcame, felt like another victory. It wasn't just about the job anymore, it was about the woman I was becoming in the process. I was learning to trust myself, to trust the choices I had made, and to believe that I had earned every ounce of respect that came my way. When the day of the operation arrived, I was ready. I had never felt more confident in my life. As I stood at the front of the room, addressing the team of soldiers who would be working under my command, I felt a sense of power that wasn't about authority. It was about respect. I had earned their trust just as I had earned my own. Today, we're not just executing an operation, I said, my voice steady, projecting across the room. We're setting a standard. We're showing what it means to be relentless in our pursuit of excellence, to rise above every challenge we face. This is more than just a mission. This is our chance to prove that we don't just meet expectations, we shatter them. The team responded with nods of agreement, their faces serious and focused. As we began the operation, I felt a sense of unity among us that I had never felt before. I wasn't just leading, I was part of something bigger. And for the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider. I felt like a leader, not because of my rank, but because of the respect I had earned through my actions. By the time the operation was over, it had been a success, not just because of the results, but because of how the team had come together, how we had all worked as one. And as I stood there, watching the team celebrate their hard work, I knew that this wasn't just a small victory. This was the beginning of a new chapter. As the days passed, I began to realize that the respect I had sought from my family, my colleagues, and even myself wasn't something I had to chase anymore. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about proving to myself that I had the strength to keep moving forward, no matter what obstacles lay ahead. I had stopped looking for validation from the outside world. Now, I was creating my own narrative. And that, more than anything, was the most empowering feeling of all. The drive back home felt longer than I remembered. The familiar roads stretched out before me, each turn, each passing landmark, a reminder of the journey I'd taken, both physically and emotionally. I had spent years trying to make my family see me for who I truly was, not just as the daughter they hoped I would be, but as the woman I had fought so hard to become. As the house came into view, I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. This time, I wasn't coming back as the woman who had failed to meet their expectations. This time, I was coming back as someone who had earned every ounce of respect I had longed for, not from them, but from myself. I had already made peace with my choices. Now it was time to show them why I had made them. The house was just as I remembered it, warm, inviting, but now somehow distant, like a place where I didn't quite belong. I stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of the years pressing down on me. It wasn't the family I was worried about, it was how I would be received. Would they see me as the woman I had become? Or would they still look at me through the lens of their expectations? When I entered the house, the air was thick with familiarity, yet a sense of change hung in the balance. My father was sitting, in his usual chair by the window, looking out at the garden. My mother was in the kitchen, humming quietly to herself. Their routines hadn't changed, but I had. And now it was time to confront that change. "Hey," I said softly, standing in the doorway. My voice felt a little foreign in this space, like it had been a lifetime since I had been this close to them. My father turned slowly, his expression unreadable. My mother poked her head around the kitchen door, her face lighting up with a smile that was both warm and cautious. I could see the hesitation in her eyes, the quiet question that always followed me when I came back. "Are you still the same person?" "I'm glad you're here," my mother said. But there was an underlying uncertainty in her voice, as if she wasn't sure whether this visit was another temporary return or the beginning of something more permanent. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. This wasn't just a visit. This was something bigger. "I wanted to talk," I said, my voice steady, "about everything, about my choices." The room fell into an expectant silence. My father didn't say anything immediately, but I could see the tension in his posture. He was waiting for me to explain myself, to justify the years I had spent away from home. My mother, on the other hand, seemed to understand what was coming, but still, she stayed quiet, waiting to see how I would handle it. I know you've both had your doubts, I continued, looking directly at them, not flinching, not backing down. You've questioned my decisions, my career, my path, and I get it. I know it wasn't what you expected from me, but I also need you to understand something. My father's gaze was piercing, and for a moment, I thought about backing down, about softening my words. But I couldn't. This was the moment I had been preparing for, the moment I had to stand firm in my truth. I did what I did because it mattered to me, I said, my voice growing stronger. And it wasn't just about defying expectations or proving a point. It was about finding my place in the world. I've worked for this. I've earned every step I've taken, and I'm proud of it. The words hung in the air, heavy and certain. For the first time, I wasn't looking for approval. I wasn't asking for their permission. I was asserting something far more important. My truth. There was a long pause. My father, who had always been the one to challenge me the hardest, sat silently, his hands clasped in his lap. He was listening, really listening. It was the first time I had ever seen him truly take me seriously. I've made mistakes, I continued, my eyes softening. I've missed moments with you, and I'm sorry for that. But I also hope you can see now that the woman I've become isn't a failure. I'm not the person you thought I was. I'm stronger than that. My father took a deep breath, and for a moment, I thought he was going to push back, to tell me I was wrong. But instead, he slowly nodded, his expression softening for the first time in years. I always wanted you to have a stable life, he said quietly, his voice filled with the weight of a father's love. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe you didn't need what I thought you needed. You found your own way, and I see that now. I could feel the air in the room shift, the tension slowly ebbing away as my father spoke. It wasn't the grand gesture I had hoped for, but it was enough. My family was finally seeing me for who I had become, not who they wanted me to be. My mother stepped forward, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She reached out to touch my arm, her grip gentle but firm. I never wanted to hold you back, she whispered. I just didn't understand. But now, I think I do. And in that moment, I felt something shift in me. The years of proving myself, the doubts, the battles fought in silence, they all began to melt away. I wasn't just reclaiming my place in their world. I was finally accepting my place in my own life. The reconciliation wasn't instant. There would still be moments of doubt, of uncertainty. But for the first time, I felt that my family was ready to accept me as I was, not as the woman they had hoped I would become, but as the woman I had worked so hard to be. As we sat together, talking quietly, I realized that this moment, this conversation, was the beginning of something new. Not just with my family, but with myself. I had finally found the courage to stand in my truth. And now, I could finally rest easy, knowing that I had reclaimed my narrative. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light across the courtyard. As I stood in front of the building, my heart racing with anticipation. The evening was drawing to a close, and the grand ceremony was about to begin. My name, once a whisper, once a subject of doubt, was finally being acknowledged in a way I had never imagined. It had been a long journey, one filled with obstacles and sacrifices. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, I was not just a woman who had fought for her place in a man's world. I was a woman who had earned that place. And as I stood there, in front of the building that would bear my name, I realized that this moment wasn't just for me. It was for every woman who had ever been told she wasn't enough. It was for every person who had been forced to fight for the right to be seen, to be heard. The crowd was gathering in front of the grand archway, and the whispers of excitement buzzed in the air. I could see familiar faces, friends, colleagues, mentors, all gathered here to witness the moment when my achievements would be formally recognized. But it wasn't just about them, it was about me. This moment was mine, and I wasn't going to let anyone else take that away from me. As I walked to the front of the crowd, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The nerves that had once consumed me were now replaced by something stronger: pride, gratitude, and a deep sense of purpose. The weight of the journey I had taken was still present, but it was no longer a burden. It was a badge of honor. The ceremony began, and the applause rippled through the crowd as I stood at the podium. I could feel the eyes of my family on me, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to justify myself. They were no longer the ones I was trying to impress. This moment, this ceremony, was my recognition, not from them, but from the world. When the moment came to speak, I took a deep breath and stepped forward. My voice was steady, but the emotions running through me were raw. "I've spent my life fighting to be seen, fighting to be heard," I began. And there were times, many times, when I doubted myself, when I questioned whether it was all worth it. But today, I stand before you, not as the woman I once was, but as the woman I have become. A woman who fought for the right to stand here, who fought to leave a legacy not just for myself, but for all of us. I paused, looking out over the crowd. My family, standing there in the front row, their faces filled with pride and admiration. They had come to see me, not as the failure they once thought I was, but as a success, a trailblazer. I could feel the weight of their approval, but more than that, I felt a sense of closure. We had come full circle. "I may have started out as someone they didn't believe in," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "But I didn't let that stop me. I didn't let their doubts define me. And today, my name is etched into history, not because of what they thought of me, but because of what I know I am capable of." The crowd's applause grew louder, but this time, it wasn't just the sound of clapping hands. It was the sound of validation. It was the sound of a story finally being told the way it was meant to be told. No longer would my name be spoken with a sense of uncertainty or judgment. It would be spoken with respect, with reverence. As I stood there, the wind gently picking up and carrying the applause across the courtyard, I thought about all the moments that had brought me here, the long nights, the doubts, the sacrifices. I thought about the countless times I had questioned myself, wondering if I was doing the right thing. But all of that seemed so far away now. The struggles, the pain, the sense of isolation, all of it had been worth it. This moment was more than just a ceremony. It was the culmination of a lifetime of fighting for my place in the world, for my right to be recognized. My name was no longer a footnote in someone else's story. It was a name that would be remembered, not for the battles I had fought, but for the victory I had earned. As I walked toward the dedication plaque, the one that would bear my name, I felt a surge of emotion. My name, Evelyn Walker, was carved into stone. It wasn't just an inscription. It was a symbol of everything I had worked for, everything I had endured. It was a symbol of resilience, of strength, of defiance in the face of doubt. I looked over at my family, their eyes now filled with something I hadn't seen before: pride, understanding, and even a touch of awe. My father, who had once questioned every decision I made, now stood with a quiet sense of admiration. My mother, who had spent years worrying about my safety and well-being, now stood with tears in her eyes. They didn't just see me as their daughter anymore. They saw me as a woman who had carved her own path and made a lasting impact. As the ceremony came to a close, I stood by the plaque, the wind rustling the flags behind me. My name, etched in stone, was a testament to the journey I had taken, to the woman I had become. And as I looked out at the crowd, I knew that this was only the beginning. The legacy I had worked so hard to build would live on, not just in the stone of the building, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who had been touched by my story. My name, once whispered in doubt, was now spoken with reverence, a legacy of empowerment, strength, and unwavering determination. I had reclaimed my story. I had redefined what success meant, and in that moment I knew that nothing could ever erase it.